to me, this is such a great example of sort of how he warps the truth to suit his narrative, but also how almost nobody at Bridgewater rises to her defense in the years to come. Where were the people saying, Ray, you have to stop showing this tape. You have to, this is not right. Everyone knew she was pregnant, but nobody was, despite all of these so-called principles about trust and truth, nobody stood up and said, don't do this.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager due diligence or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we will have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager, Niels Larsen.
For me, the best part of my podcasting journey has been the opportunity to speak to a huge range of extraordinary people from all around the world. In this series, I have invited one of them, namely Kevin Coldiron, to host a series of in-depth conversations to help uncover and explain new ideas to make you a better investor. In the series, Kevin will be speaking to authors of new books and research papers to better understand the global economy and the dynamics that shape it, so that we can all successfully navigate the challenges within it. And with that, please welcome Kevin Coldiron.
All right. Thanks, Niels, and welcome everyone to our last show of 2023, which I think is going to be a real treat. Our guest is Rob Copeland. He's a finance reporter for the New York Times and author of the best-selling new book, The Fund, Ray Dalio, Bridgewater Associates, and the Unravelling of a Wall Street Legend. To be honest, I kind of struggled to find the right adjectives to describe this book. Eye-opening for sure, even kind of mind-blowing in parts, but it's also deeply thought-provoking because it forces us to confront deeper ideas of truth and transparency. Are they universally good? Can they even properly exist in a situation where there's deep imbalances of power? Questions like that. But even if you're not interested in those deeper questions, it's a book that's filled with fascinating anecdotes and gives us a real look inside a kind of secret world. So, Rob, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So this is a book about Bridgewater Associates and its founder, Ray Dalio. Many of our listeners are finance people, so they know Bridgewater, they know Ray Dalio. But for those of listeners that don't know them, I was wondering if you could kind of give us a quick summary of Bridgewater as a company and the philosophy that its founder, Ray Dalio, used to run the firm.
Sure. So first of all, I would say there's two versions of this story. There's the story that Ray Dalio tells, which is that he built the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, in large part due to his philosophy, these so-called principles, which basically involve a long study of history and arguing with one another to get to find what he would call the truth. And the big reveal for me, and been this project, this book took the better part of 10 years, is that Ray Dalio was already a billionaire. He was already incredibly wealthy before he invents the term principles out of thin air in around 2005. So what the principles are really are an effort by Ray to retrofit a sort of overarching philosophical reason for his success when there's absolutely no hard evidence that anything is true.
You talked about this being a 10-year-long project. Can you maybe go into a little bit of your history with Bridgewater? I mean, you don't play a prominent role yourself in the book, but you are in there because you've been reporting on Bridgewater for a long time. Before the New York Times, you were at the Wall Street Journal, where you were the hedge fund beat reporter, and you became well known for a number of kind of front page stories about Bridgewater. So could you kind of tell us how you first got introduced to the firm, and then how that led to your interaction with Ray Dalio, and then eventually the book.
Well known is a lot. I appreciate that. I think well known among my four siblings and my parents for sure, as the only kid in the family to write for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I actually used to write for a trade publication called Absolute Return, which covered the hedge fund industry. So I knew Bridgewater and Ray Dalio because it was the world's biggest, and that was our entire world. I started writing about Bridgewater in actually 2015. Ray puts out what he calls these daily observations, these macroeconomic notes that I'm sure some of your listeners even receive now. And we very rarely wrote about them, but it piqued my interest one day. Someone sent me one, and he had sort of flipped his view on China. He had gone from bullish to fairly bearish on China. And we wrote that up, and, Ray hit the roof. And he called me, and he was basically trying to walk back everything that he had actually written in his own words. And, it wasn't a turnoff for me. It was sort of like addicting. You get the world's biggest hedge fund manager, and he's on the phone, and he seems to be listening to your perspective. And, he's agitated, but as a journalist, sometimes people are agitated by your work. And then over the years, I kept writing about Ray and Bridgewater because the chasm between the Ray Dalio that he was playing on TV and in TED Talks and in his books was so different from what I was hearing from people inside Bridgewater about the way he acts. Now, just like Ray Dalio sort of retrofitted the principles to explain his success, he has also retrofitted a personal animus of my own, which is that I'm 36, and when I was 23, I didn't have a job that I liked, and I applied to basically every job in the New York tri-state area, among them Bridgewater Associates. So to hear Ray Dalio tell it, I am like an aggrieved job applicant who has been on what would have to be just an absolutely incredible revenge tour of 15 years. But I can just say that it's just a complete distraction. Ray universally dislikes independent thought particularly by journalists that just say the true facts of what he's like behind the scenes. So, he attacks me, he attacks other reporters. To me, it's not that interesting, to be honest. There's a lot of successful business figures who like to make the media a foil. And I don't have any personal, honestly, feelings at all about Ray, besides that he's a wonderful, newsworthy topic for a book.
So you were writing these articles about Bridgewater. At what stage did you think, okay, there's more here. There's enough that I can kind of turn this into a book?
At every stage. And the thing about Ray is it's so wild. It's so different from any other Wall Street firm. At one point, he writes his own book in 2017 called Principles, Life and Work. And though it's in the nonfiction section in many bookstores, it really is fiction. And that was the moment when I realized that if I didn't do it, if I didn't use my ability to talk to hundreds of people inside Bridgewater, that he was going to, frankly, get away with painting this completely up is down, right is wrong version of himself. He made it easier on me in many ways because he spent so much money becoming famous and, being interviewed by Gwyneth Paltrow and being on every major news network. Every single time he became more and more famous, to me, it felt like more and more of an imperative for, an independent journalist to actually tell the truth.
You must be a pretty determined guy because, you say in the book that Bridgewater hired not one, but not two, but three different firms to, how do I say, aggressively dissuade you from writing the book to...
you can say they threatened a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. That's a fact.
So, how did that feel? That must have felt kind of scary. I mean, your publisher must also be quite determined. How did you kind of personally react to that?
Well, I knew he wouldn't be thrilled with the book. He's actually the first person I told after I signed the book deal. I didn't want this to be something where I was slinking around in the corners. And one of Ray's principles is trust in truth. So a part of me actually thought that maybe he might actually have a small part of himself that was curious what the execution of trust and truth is actually like. I will say, when they threatened me with all those lawyers, all this multi-billion-dollar lawsuit, it's almost a joke to me, because you could threaten me with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It would have the same effect. I'm not, that would bankrupt me either way. And not to be jingoistic, but, in the United States of America, we have pretty good protections for journalists. And I had many stories of Ray threatening his own staff, being cruel to his own family. So to me, the way that he wielded his fortune to try to squash this book is really not that different from what he's done for decades behind the scenes to people who he has an actual personal relationship with.
So let's maybe dig into it a little bit. You started with the story of Paul McDowell, who is a consultant that was brought in to develop the internal software that Bridgewater uses to rank and give feedback to employees. And eventually, this kind of technology became baseball cards. Kind of like each person carried around this card that included their rankings, et cetera. But can you kind of explain how the baseball cards worked, what the logic was behind them?
So at Bridgewater, Ray comes up with this sort of never-ending collection of personality categories to rate each other on. So they can be things as simple as, your ability to listen, and they can be things as complicated as, breaking through to the truth. And these other sort of nebulous categories. And his grand goal, as he said so many times, was to be able to rank everyone at Bridgewater on what is functionally a single scale, so that, if you and I were talking, that we would be able to look at a metric and say that one of us is more believable, is one of us should be trusted more than the other. Now, this manifests itself in what Ray begins to call baseball cards, just as, a baseball player might have a stat sheet, their RBIs, their ERA, everything, that we would have a single card that we could look at and we could say, Kevin is really good at XYZ and Rob is really good at XYZ, more commonly, by the way, what we're bad at. And then, that would sort of guide our power at the hedge fund. Now, he's talked about this publicly a lot. What the story of Paul McDowell and so many others at the firm shows you is that this entire system, this entire ranking system, functions and was rigged from the start to rank Ray Dalio at the top. And
yeah, that story is, it's funny because I have to say my emotions kind of waxed and waned in reading your book. At some level, the principle of, hey, let's get at the truth. What is it? Pain plus reflection equals growth. Those principles kind of are, at some level sensible and powerful. But then you say, when they first implemented the baseball cards, what happened was that Ray Dalio did not show up at the top in terms of believability. And McDowell was like, hey, that shows the system's working, right? It's uncovering pockets of believability that we wouldn't have seen. But he didn't interpret it that way. How did he interpret it, and what happened?
Well, Ray sees it as the opposite. He sees it as the system is not working, because if the system thinks that someone else is ranked higher than Ray in an important category, the system must be broken, because to Ray Dalio, he's obviously the best. And he has the ability to point to what he would call a long-term investment track record and say, hey, I've done so well. I mean, literally one of his favorite phrases is, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? So what McDowell and others at the firm do is they build a fully self-reinforcing system where Ray's ratings are hardwired, virtually unable to be dislodged from the top of the system. And what you just described is in the introduction to the book. So fair enough to say it's sort of off to the races from there.
How well known was it in Bridgewater that Ray Dalio's rankings were kind of, I don't know what you said, rigged or kind of adjusted so that everything kind of was scored relative to him? Was that kind of widely known?
The the effect of it was widely known. It seems to me that no one inside Bridgewater ever believed in the principles, except for Ray Dalio, maybe himself. The fact that it was rigged and how it was rigged is something that took me many years to uncover, because there are plenty of examples of people at Bridgewater who tried to sort of speak truth to Ray and to this idea of a system, and were just, well, as the book goes into, it's sort of like, trying to run up an icy hill. You just keep sliding backwards. It wasn't until relatively late, many years into my reporting into Bridgewater, that I was actually able to prove that this had been rigged at Ray's behest from the beginning. And, well, of course it was. Once you know the story of Bridgewater, you realize, of course it was. But actually proving it is something else entirely.
It seems like in reading the book, in some sense, you're almost kind of retelling the same story, but it's a different character that it's happening to. And it felt to me like there was this tool of radical transparency was the notion of investigations or probes. So people would be performing badly, or there would be particular violation of a principle or transgression, and then there would be essentially an interrogation, a trial that sometimes was led by Dalio, sometimes in front of the whole firm, always taped, and even became kind of case studies. Can you maybe give an example of one of those trials? And I was thinking of the one, Katina Stefanova, who is a central character in the book. She's interesting in that she was considered to be one of, very close to Dalio, even up to the point, I think, where she left the firm. She thought there was kind of a close relationship there. So it would seem from the outside that she would be a kind of an unusual target for trial, but even someone close to Dalio, in your telling, was subject to that. So can you maybe explain how these interrogations or trials or probes worked, using her as an example?
I would add one thing to that, actually, which is that it's not even only people close to Ray were subject to the full brunt of this system, but actually it's a crucial central part of Ray's success, is that he was and is able to pull people in and then humiliate them, because it sort of shows, the closer you get to the sun, the hotter it is. At Bridgewater, everything is and was taped. He called it radical transparency. So he had this huge repository of all these, what he would call case studies and probings. And again, if you think about it just on its face, it doesn't sound crazy, right? It doesn't sound, okay, so everything can be viewed by everyone at the firm, and then we can learn from one another. And then if we're having a disagreement, we can always pull back and we can say, hey, actually, Kevin, let's rewind to, 2 weeks ago when we talked about this. Kind of feels like that might have been the moment where things went awry and we can learn from it. But of course, with Ray, nothing is ever exactly as he describes it. He begins to make these case studies in which he is probing, in his words, the badness of those around him. And one of them is Katina Stefanova, who is subject to a seminal case study at Bridgewater, in which Ray is interrogating her for the fact that she wasn't able to hire people as fast as he wanted. And she's sobbing, she is crying, and he is tearing into her. And Ray releases this tape internally, and then to job candidates of this woman sobbing. And he calls it pain plus reflection equals progress, as you pointed out, one of his favorite principles. And he says, this is how we are here. How does this make you feel? There's two crucial things that he doesn't say about that case study. One, the edited tape is edited in a way that makes Katina seem like she's having an inappropriate emotional reaction. Ray seems like he's being kind to her, and Katina seems like she's losing it. So the lesson that Ray wants you to learn is, that Ray is just trying to help, and that you're not letting him help you. And the other sort of mic drop moment
how do you know that, Rob? I mean, have you seen the full unedited tape?
I have spoken to lots of people who were there for the original probing, and lots of people who have listened to the tape. I've asked Bridgewater for these tapes. I've asked them to release them publicly, frankly, so that everyone can see. They won't do that. The other thing that Ray leaves out about his probing of Katina is that she was pregnant the whole time. So he's making a snuff film of him tearing into a pregnant employee. And she's not just crying because, I mean, I would probably cry, honestly, if my billionaire boss were making such a over-the-top example of me. But she's literally pregnant the whole time. And he knows that. He knows that for years afterwards because she has the baby. And to me, this is such a great example of sort of how he warps the truth to suit his narrative, but also how almost nobody at Bridgewater rises to her defense in the years to come. Where were the people saying, Ray, you have to stop showing this tape. You have to, like, this is not right. Everyone knew she was pregnant, but nobody was, despite all of these so-called principles about trust and truth, nobody stood up and said, don't do this.
Yeah, and that's where I started thinking about the more philosophical aspects of your book about, telling truths and transparency. And I kind of came down on the side of, as long as there's a power imbalance, and the bigger the power imbalance, the more difficult it is for people to quote unquote speak the truth, right? If you and I are kind of on the same level, we can give each other feedback and don't have to worry necessarily about repercussions. But if you've got a billionaire founder of a hedge fund and you've got other employees, they're going to be circumspect about speaking the truth. And actually, the system itself ought to recognize it. If the system is about understanding truth, it ought to recognize that if there's a power imbalance, people aren't going to be willing to speak the truth. And so it should be kind of adjusted in some sense to take account of that. If you really were invested in a system that kind of brought out, that made an effort to bring out truth.
Well, what I love so much, honestly, about the book, which is there's a lot of fun moments for me, at least as a reader of the book. It's not just a T-Rex stomping through the halls for 300 pages. Is that there are such glimmers of hope. There are so many moments where people they do what you are suggesting, and the way that Ray is able to sort of weaponize the principles, and in its later years weaponize the celebrity that he has attained from the principles. It's honestly a lesson for any boss, but it's also a lesson for any employee of how you can sort of check your own values from your family, from your religion, from your community, from wherever you've learned, and you sort of find yourself adopting this distorted view of reality from your employer, both because he's paying you a lot of money and because you've perhaps bought into this idea that his philosophy is what made him rich, and that you need to match that philosophy or you yourself will never be successful. It's a mind game for sure.
Yeah. They have this thing that I think you call, or maybe internally called, the MC cycle, the management committee cycle. And the notion was that, the MC cycle was they would hire in quite senior level, often well-known investment professionals into a kind of a management committee level position, and then say, okay, your first job is going to be something outside your area of expertise, oftentimes in a kind of a junior role. And the person would be a bit surprised, but they go off and do it. And then because it's, outside what they were expecting to do, often outside their area of expertise, often they failed at it or didn't do as well. And then that would give Bridgewater a chance to kind of probe or investigate that person. And, there's a lot of kind of high level people went through that cycle and left afterwards. And that's I guess that's why it's called the cycle. Bridgewater would say, hey, that's just testing to see whether these people can make it in our culture, whether they're suited to the way we do business here. How do you react to that kind of description of the MC cycle?
Well, if that were true, then some of them would succeed, and it seems so remarkable that for so many decades, every single person that Ray brought in, he would find a reason to humiliate them and to show that they weren't quite his equal. I would say this goes back to a principle, and Ray has a principle. Though he changes them all the time, so even calling them principles is as a fixed group is a bit of a misnomer. But he says that at Bridgewater, people have to be willing to humiliate themselves to get at the truth. So I would say that the MC cycle, which isn't my term, by the way, it's other people's term, it is that principle in action. He's making sure that he humiliates you right at the start. And I think the sort of $150 billion question around Bridgewater is why so many people were willing to put up with this for sort of like a chance, just even as the slim chance at succeeding Ray Dalio atop Bridgewater.
Well, why do you think that is? What's your personal view on that?
Every
Is
time,
it money?
Well, money helps for sure. But remember, you are joining a society, I should say, you are joining an organization that operates, off the grid, with a charismatic founder, with a strict dogma and harsh punishment to those who cross the line. So you don't really have a choice unless that choice is to walk out the door. There's a wonderful documentary called The Vow about an organization in upstate New York. And a part of the documentary, they get into this woman who's locked in a room for 2 years, and she doesn't leave the room except to use the restroom. And the mic drop moment at the end of one of those episodes is the room isn't locked. She has left herself in the room. And so because her family and everyone around her, she sort of been psychologically told that she can't leave. And I think there's a lesson there in Bridgewater. It's not that anyone's been forced there. They're not shackled. They get to go home at the end of the night, but the door isn't locked. But that doesn't mean that they can just leave.
So it's a desire to prove that they can make it in this ultra-competitive environment. It's a desire to eventually get Ray Dalio's approval.
Exactly. And remember, you've got your billionaire founder is on TV, and all these famous people are saying it's so fabulous that you're giving away the secrets to your success. So if you're inside Bridgewater, you're saying, I have a chance to really learn something about my own instincts, my suboptimal instincts, and to turn myself into someone as successful as Ray Dalio. And when you begin to question the whole system, which so many people do, you just have this wall in front of you. You have people like Adam Grant, the Wharton psychologist, who was being paid by Ray to proselytize for him and the principles. So it's not merely just questioning and saying, oh, I see it the other way. You sort of have to dump out an entire indoctrination system. And it's very difficult for people to this day.
What do you think, because as you say, Ray Dalio was a billionaire before the principles emerged or were birthed. What do you think his core skill is? Kind of putting aside the principles, et cetera. Because clearly he's a skilled man, and I'm just kind of curious what you if you had to kind of evaluate him, what would you say it is, or his core skills?
He's a skilled storyteller, is what he is. He very early in his career figured out that if he told wealthy families and institutions that his goal was not to necessarily make them the most money, but to protect them. This is like sort of an obvious now hedge fund marketing pitch, is like, we protect against your downside. But that wasn't always obvious in the 80s and the 90s. And we should give Ray credit that regardless of what the truth of what Bridgewater was investing was actually like, that was the story he was telling, and it was incredibly effective. Many other firms have since tried basically the same approach, and no one has been as good as Ray Dalio at marketing it. And then he becomes a skilled storyteller in telling the story of himself and the principles. He's incredibly charming in a way. I've met him in person a number of times because he will look you in the eyes and just spend hours telling you about the principles, to the point where if he doesn't believe it himself, then he deserves the Academy Award for Best Actor. So if he believes it himself, which he is able to communicate so powerfully, it's sort of hard for you not to believe it, because who are you to say these aren't the keys to his success?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that question. I'm glad you brought that up about him believing in the principles, because when I read the book, at certain times I'm like, okay, this is just a tool of control. In other words, you bring someone in, they make a transgression, you humiliate them, you tape it, it's played over and over again. That's that's not dedication to the truth. That's just using your power to show what I can do to someone. And it's an example of, hey, if anyone else falls out of line, this is what's going to happen to you. That emotion came up a number of times to me, which actually, I may be dating myself here, but if you read the Orwell book Animal Farm, it's very. I kept thinking about Animal Farm the whole time. This, which is a kind of a satire of how the Communist Party and the Soviet Union worked.
Well, it is at Bridgewater. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I thought of that book a lot.
Yeah, precisely, and it's it's a tool for psychological control. So my question is, does Ray see it that way, like deep down? Do you think, or does he actually think, no, this is that we're applying the principle of radical transparency in its purest form? Like, is he a believer or?
Yeah. I've thought about this a lot, and I did, spend the better part of a number of years now really trying to put myself in his shoes, because I don't think it's fair or interesting to write, like a hit piece of a book. I'm trying to show you how this evolves over time, why people buy into it. They're not all evil, and also why Ray seems so stubborn about not recognizing the truth of what he's created, and I have to believe that he believes it, because look, as the book has, there are many examples of people putting in writing, Ray, people think this is a cult. Ray, people are scared of you. And he responds to these emails. But his response is always, we should look in the principles for a guide. And if I knew a better way to help you, I would. So for me to believe that he is totally full of it and doesn't believe it, I think is to believe in like such a sociopathic villain that I can't believe that. Instead, I think this has gotten a little out of control for Ray, and he's in too deep. He's made his whole identity the principles, and for him to admit now that actually it never worked the way he was describing, and in fact, for years it has been really the opposite of what he was describing. It would require him to do what he claims to be so good at, but of course is so terrible at in practice, which is to hear the hard truth and to admit a mistake. And I actually find that a very relatable thing about Ray Dalio. I think we all find it hard to admit a mistake, but for him, admitting a mistake, I mean, he would be admitting that the whole thing, the principles are a fraud, and I think we can all understand why he wouldn't want to do that.
Kind of admitting a mistake or admitting things aren't as they seem also applies in your book to the investment process, which, as a former investment professional, that kind of shocked me the most, because our firm, tiny as it was, ran systematic strategies. We often described ourselves as doing very similar to what Bridgewater described. There's a series of signals, and you pick, you're trawling for data, you put that into a portfolio that's, stable, that can produce modest returns in most market environments, no big drawdowns. So Dalio and Bridgewater have described themselves as being kind of very data-driven, systematic. And, in your book, you say, actually, that's not the case, that most of the people, there's only a small, I think you call it the circle of trust, a small group of people that are actually involved in the investment process. And it's much less intensive, systematic than it's described. And there's a quote I want to read out, which comes from your book, that says, there was essentially no grand system, no artificial intelligence of any substance, no holy grail. There was just Dalio in person, over the phone, from his yacht, or a few weeks, many summers, from his villa in Spain, calling the shots. That's from your book. And I should say that you also include in the book a response from Bridgewater that says that notion that it's just Dalio calling the shots is false. They responded that way. How did you kind of uncover that aspect of of Bridgewater?
Well, obviously I can't talk about like who I spoke to, but I can say I'm very comfortable with the conclusions that I drew. Remember that the story that Ray and Bridgewater tell about the investment process is basically this like magical mystery bus investment process where we have these rules that they say are, quote, these are Ray's words, timeless and universal, that he has these investment rules which have worked forever, and will continue to work, and they're secret, and he won't show anyone. You know, as an investor, and so do most people on the street, that successful firms spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars every year trying to find one small edge in the market that they know will not exist forever, exploit it for as long as possible, and then find the next one. So the idea that Ray Dalio has hundreds of timeless and universal rules that he has written down in a proverbial notebook is, to me, risible. And there's a reason why they aren't suing me, because they'd have to prove that I'm wrong, and I'm not. So far as the idea of this investment system, it goes back to Ray being a great storyteller. There's something incredibly appealing about knowing that your money is safe, because it's not about one man's instinct and ideas. It's about this huge, quantitative, really untouchable approach, which has produced so-called alpha, for the better part of 50 years. What was so remarkable to me about, you're talking about particularly one chapter where I talk a lot about the investment process, is he also has to keep the story going about the investment process, because he says that these systematized principles really stemmed from the approach that he took to build the investment process. So for him to admit that the investment process isn't as he claims, it's not too far a walk to that the principles aren't as what he claims. So that began to explain for me why he is so protective of this narrative, that there are this secret set of rules. You mentioned the sort of the responses that his lawyers sent me that we did include in the book. I wanted to include his perspective. I want readers to be able to hear in his own words how he describes it. What was quite amusing to me is that in these months and years of letters, they just kept saying that the system is 98% systematized, or the trading is 98%, or the risk is 98% systematized. The number was always 98, never 97, never 99. But the category seemed to change, to the point where I was just reading their responses and just saying like, oh, this is just a game of Mad Libs at a certain point. Again, it wouldn't be hard. They could show their investors. They could show me. I've met with many successful investors who had complicated investment processes, and they have a way of explaining it that makes lucid sense. And I think it's quite telling that Bridgewater still, and Ray Dalio, has not produced one single one of these so-called timeless and universal rules. They just haven't.
Yeah, you say it often boils down to a set of if-then rules, which in the end felt a lot like trend following, identifying a trend and following it. You did say that there was always, or there had been for quite a long time, a concern or a question mark around them, in the sense that they're huge, right? They're over 100 billion at one stage, and that should leave a footprint in the market, right? For absolutely should. And one of the animating principles of our firm was, hey, we're going to keep it small because we don't want people to see what we're doing, right? So size often is the enemy of success in investing, right? You get so big that people can see what you're doing, they can imitate it, and your edge goes away. So there was a concern or an issue that, hey, we don't see Bridgewater in the markets. And at one stage, there was even an investigation by Harry Markopolos, who was the guy who figured out that Madoff was a Ponzi scheme. And you say, hey, Bridgewater's not a Ponzi scheme. But what wasn't clear to me in the book is how that issue was resolved. I mean, why don't we see a bigger footprint from Bridgewater in the markets?
So I'm going to give you two answers. One is that that's a question for Bridgewater to answer. The fact is that they quite enjoy the fact that people think that they're so large and mysterious. I can tell you that according to my reporting, they spend a tremendous amount of money on what are essentially a series of proverbial interlocking tubes that send their trades through other names, and that this costs an incredible amount in trading costs. Someone told me as much as 6 percentage points every year, just to hide their trading, because they want people to think that it's a secret system. The SEC looked into Harry Markopolos' allegations, to believe that Bridgewater is a Ponzi scheme is such a conspiracy. Bernie Madoff had a separate floor where 7 or so people knew it was a Ponzi scheme. There would be hundreds of people at Bridgewater who knew and participated. You'd believe that the SEC went in there, saw the trading system, and was fooled. So that's why I say it's not a Ponzi scheme. But that isn't to say that everything is as Ray or Bridgewater describes it. I mean, these so-called rules, in my findings, they come down to if Ray thinks of something, then it's a rule because he claims it's due to his study of history over many decades. Now, I think there's another word for that, and that's just called discretionary macro trading.
Right.
And I wouldn't call that a rule.
Which is a fine, legitimate, strategy that many people follow. I'll maybe kind of wrap up the questions here. So I know your time is kind of running out, but one thing that I thought about in the book is external investors kicking the tires, right? Because I've been through that process many times with sophisticated institutional investors. They really want to know the process, right? Not the secret rules, but they want to get a lot of transparency. I've sat down for hours and gone through lots of detail with some of the same people that invested with Bridgewater. And another thing that comes up a lot in these due diligence sessions is, hey, Ray, or hey, Kevin, how much time are you spending on the investment process versus, running the firm? And, even running a tiny firm of 20 people, I would get that question sometime. You're getting diluted. You're managing the business, not the investment process. So you've got this situation at Bridgewater where there's thousands of people working there. Did those issues not come up, or was it just the past returns were so good that people were willing to put all that aside?
I will answer you by pointing you that actually Ray in the book, he talks to investors fairly often. And what does he talk to them about? He talks to them about the principles. When investors come into Bridgewater, they get this pseudo philosophy from him. And that's quite appealing to many of them. I actually, after the book came out, I heard from a major Bridgewater investor who was asking me questions about the trading. And I said, well, why don't you ask them? And he was like, they have a wonderful client services team, but we talked to them about, their high level view on what to do with our portfolio. And I said, well, why don't you ask them what they're doing with your money that you've given them to invest? I'm not saying that this organization should redeem by any stretch. I was just saying, you're the client. It's your money. You can ask. There are a lot of very smart investors in Bridgewater and other funds. But I will say that as someone who covers this space, there is a chasm often between the sophistication of the end investor, the investment officer at a pension fund, or even a sovereign wealth fund, and the sophistication of the manager. And I think for many years, many investors of Bridgewater were sort of just happy to say that they had money with the world's biggest hedge fund, and to say, well, it must be safe because it's the biggest. I share a bit of your befuddlement, because believe me, if I had an hour with the Bridgewater Investment Committee, I would have no trouble asking a lot of questions, learning a lot of things. And there are some very large investors who have the ability to ask for that hour, and to my knowledge, have not.
Well, I appreciate that, Rob, and I appreciate the book and the just the time and the effort and the dedication to doing your investigation. And journalism is extremely important, especially now. The book is called The Fund, and I think it's a good Christmas read, right? It's got great anecdotes and stories, and also some deeper points if you want to go there. So, Rob, thanks so much for joining the show. We wish you all the best.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Rob and Kevin, for an absolutely fascinating look into the world's largest hedge fund, and of course, its founder. Of course, I can't comment on any of the findings that Rob has made and written about, but there's one thing that strikes me and that I'm left with having heard this conversation. And it's a very simple question, namely, if this was all made up by Rob, why hasn't Bridgewater followed through with a lawsuit against him? Well, that's it for today. make sure you go and follow Rob's work and Kevin's work, as well as getting a copy of their books so that you can judge it yourself. And because, as you can tell from today's conversation, some of these ideas and topics may not be discussed enough in mainstream media. From Kevin and me, thanks ever so much for listening. We look forward to being back with you on the next episode of the Ideas Lab. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.